Okay, so welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar on the third day of Colorado Endangered Species Week. My name is Chris Heindel. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm a communications director and on the leadership team here at Rocky Mountain Wild. For a visual description, I'm a light-skinned, mixed race individual, buzzed salt and pepper hair, and millions of freckles. And I'm wearing a white t-shirt with the Rocky Mountain Wild logo. Before we begin and before we introduce our panelists here, I'm going to be sharing a land acknowledgement. So my grandfather came to the United States from the Temiskaming Reserve in Quebec, but I'm not in my kin's territory and I haven't been invited or welcomed here through ceremony by this state's rightful stewards, so I'm an unwelcome guest. It is from this perspective that I offer this land acknowledgement. The state of Colorado was formed from the stolen and unceded lands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, Ute, and 48 tribal nations that are historically tied to the lands through state-sanctioned acts of genocide, displacement, and dispossession. I want to acknowledge the particularly sordid history of the creation of Colorado, one where when the Cheyenne and Arapaho people refused to sign the 1861 Treaty of Fort Wise, Governor Evans took it by force, providing no financial compensation. He then issued a proclamation authorizing citizens of Colorado to kill and destroy as enemies of the country all hostile Indians. That's a direct quote, which directly led to the Sand Creek Massacre. That proclamation was finally rescinded in August 2021 by Governor Polis. So it was still on the books when I moved here. So we have a lot of healing to do. And as a first step towards accountability and reconciliation, I ask that we commit to knowing this history and honoring our collective ancestors who stewarded the land and protected the species native to it long before we came, until such time that the land is ceded to its rightful stewards and all marginalized communities are treated equitably with justice at the forefront. And just as the species we acknowledge and learn about during Colorado Endangered Species Week aren't helped by simply stating the threats that they face, we need to take action. So I ask everyone to offer any meaningful action you are aware of in the chat. So I have 3 actions I'd like to share. First, I think it's important to really know this history. I wasn't aware that the Cheyenne and Arapaho never signed the treaty until I heard that from an elder, Rick Williams, who let me know that history. I would ask that folks follow Rick's organization, People of the Sacred Land, to learn more about Colorado's specific and horrific history. So I'll drop a link in the chat in a moment to that organization. I also ask that folks with means support Spirit of the Sun, which is a local Indigenous nonprofit. Spirit of the Sun recognizes that climate justice, environmental justice, and racial justice are not separate from each other, but that the fight for one is the fight for all 3. So please help support their programming with a donation today if you're able, and I'll also drop that link into the chat. And the third action that I would ask folks to do is when you submit public comments about management of public lands, include that you want to see co-management with Indigenous tribes. So I had the pleasure of hearing from Indigenous Elder John Eckelhock, who suggested that we always ask our agencies to co-manage the land with Indigenous tribes as a first step. So I ask us to share actions at all Zoom meetings that Rocky Mountain Wild has. So hopefully if you've been to one before, you have an action ready. But if this is your first event, first of all, welcome. And if you don't have an action to share today, please don't worry about it. Just take the actions offered here today and think about and research others that you may do in the future to help us heal and build meaningful community. So I'd also like to share a little Zoom housekeeping before we really get started. So to participate, feel free to use the chat function, the reaction emojis, give snaps, or whatever else you'd like to do to react. But please stay on mute. We are recording this event, so you're welcome to stay on camera or remain off, whatever your comfort level and spirit calls you to do. If you have any questions throughout the talk, feel free to drop them in the chat. We have enabled auto captioning, so if that's something that's helpful for you, at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see a box that says CC Live Transcription, where you can enable that for yourself. And I'll drop those directions in the chat as well for anyone who may not have heard me. So I also want to thank and acknowledge Denver Zoo and Clove and Twine for sponsoring today's panel. Without their generosity and the generosity of all our sponsors and our speakers, of course, we couldn't host this week or these events. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Rosie to start the self-introductions of our esteemed panel.
Malo Keen, buenos dias, hello all. My name is Rosie Sanchez, she, her, ella pronouns. I am a now second year PhD student at the University of Colorado Boulder, studying carnivore ecology with a focus on Indigenous and Western science, co-stewardship, co-management, um, ways of being when it comes to wildlife management through um, a wildlife law lens, I would say, and how to conduct research in a collaborative and co-governance structure. That's a little bit about me. I'm also on the board of Rocky Mountain Wild, and I am also a member of the Next 100 Colorado and volunteer leader with Latino Outdoors. I have a passion for wolverines, and I'm very excited for them to return, well, to have come back in larger numbers to Colorado, and I'm very excited to be here with y'all today. I'll go ahead and pass it to Stefan.
All right, hi everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. My name is Stefan Ekernas. Pronouns are he, him. I am the director of Colorado Field Conservation for Denver Zoo. I have a PhD in fish and wildlife biology from University of Montana. Though in all my time in Montana, unfortunately, never had the joy of seeing a wolverine, though I spent a lot of time looking. Yeah, maybe quick background. I sort of at Megan Mueller, who you'll hear from next, really urging, kind of joined the Colorado Wolverine Coalition about a year ago, and have been, really thrilled to have been part of the success that we've seen. So it's it's been kind of an amazing roller coaster every year. I'm not, I guess uphill, it's been amazing, uphill and downhill because it's been easy. So whichever way, it's been great. It's been an amazing year. So yeah, with that, I'll maybe turn it over to Megan.
Hi, everybody. It's great to be here with you all. I am Megan Mueller. I use she, her pronouns. For a visual description, I have kind of graying hair. I'm wearing a dark colored shirt and a necklace, and I'm white with green eyes. I am a conservation biologist and member of the leadership team with Rocky Mountain Wild. So we work to conserve wildlife and wildlands here in Colorado. And as part of that job, I lead a really big coalition of conservation organizations in Colorado that's working to bring wolverines back to Colorado. I have also always loved wolverines. I also got my master's degree in environmental studies and wildlife biology from the University of Montana. And I was actually fortunate to see a wolverine in Denali National Park on my honeymoon. So it was like my honeymoon, this place that I had always wanted to see, and then a wolverine. So it was pretty great. So I have a sort of a special connection with wolverines, and it has been really exciting this year to make so much progress towards reintroduction after working on it for more than a decade with Rocky Mountain Wild and other organizations. So it's exciting to be here, and let's go ahead and get into the presentation. And we'll start with Stefan.
Megan, do you want to share screen? Do you want me to share screen? How do you want to do that?
I can do it. Let's see.
Fire away.
Let me. Sorry, let me get up to the top. All right, there you go. Is everybody seeing that?
Yep, perfect. And maybe as an introduction, just to what this looked like, I think we're the three of us are going to speak to for about 5 to 10 minutes each. So the goal is to, have plenty of time for questions. Please ask questions, whether it sounds like Chris in the chat is probably the best way to do that. Or from my end, you can interrupt me, I don't mind. So what we're going to do, I'm going to start by just talking about basic wolverine biology, so I'm giving some basics of what the species is and why we should care about them. So wolverines are unlike their names, so unlike their similar names of wolves, so they're very different from wolves. So wolverines are weasels. They're solitary. They're the largest member of the weasel family that's terrestrial. There's the river otter, I believe, is the South American river is quite a bit bigger. But of the terrestrial members of the weasel family, it's the largest one, maxes out about 40 pounds. Solitary, they're pretty amazing animals. They're primarily scavengers, especially in winter. So actually, we can go to the next slide. I should probably tell you that, Megan. All right. So there's a wolverine, and here are their other very cool members. So they're, weasels are in general an extremely cool lineage of animals. They're both cute and ferocious, which is like what's not to love about that. So they tend to be, they're carnivores, and they like really wolverines. So if you go to the next slide, wolverines they're really cold specialists. So they're cold adapted. And we'll talk about that here in a second, but we'll show you a map where their distribution, but they're really specialists on cold. They make dens. Most dens are 10 feet deep snow, so they're snow dependent, and therefore thought to be quite climate sensitive as we start losing snowpack, particularly at the southern edge of the range. But in winter, they're scavengers, and so they scavenge on dead elk, deer, moose, bison, caribou, whatever they find, right? Carcasses of dead animals. They tend to love basins, so you find like bowls in mountains. That's really where like carcasses collect. That's a lot of the time they spend a lot of time in those kind of topography. Again, looking for dead animals, dead carcasses in winter. They have huge home ranges, so hundreds of square miles. There was a recent paper that came out that Rosie sent. Thank you for that paper, where they looked at densities and in a couple of different places in Canada, and there were essentially between 3.5 to about 6.5 wolverines per 1,000 square kilometers. So you're talking about a really low density species that's really adapted, again, to like find. It's not like there's huge densities of animals in a lot of places where they live, right? So they have to be adapted to like have home ranges as a way to find food. So really big home ranges. In summer, they tend to live off of they switch from being pure scavengers to also being predators, and particularly eating a lot of rodents like marmots, which is actually my personal arch nemesis animal because one ate a tent of mine, and so I personally love that they eat marmots. So yeah, they're pretty great animals. If you go to the next slide, Megan. So you can see they're really an Arctic. They're really kind of a cold adapted cold specialist. Colorado, which is not on the map. It's on the map, but it's outside the range on the map because of its current distribution. So it is in fact the southernmost distribution of the species historically, and that's because of our obviously very high mountains that create really cold weather patterns. So if you go to the next slide, so this is essentially wolverine habitat in the lower 48, where and these are showing they're color coded just by different mountain ranges in different regions. And in that blue dotted line, that's our current distribution. There are some animals that go down in the yellow part in Wyoming down to the Wind River Range. But then the biggest part really, so the distribution, the lines are a little fuzzy, right? But the point is that these animals have not, there's really no easy way for them to get into Colorado. And Colorado represents the largest unoccupied patch of habitat remaining in the lower 48. If you go to the next slide, what you'll see here, so these are historic distributions of historic locations of wolverines. And you can see that there were, they used to actually be even in the northern Midwest. But they used to be, down here, they used to be, quite common in Colorado. So, I mean, common by wolverine standards, that is. We used to have a breeding population. It was due to unregulated trapping and hunting. It was essentially the last one was killed in 1919. So it hasn't been here. It's been more than 100 years since it's been here. But if you go to the next slide, we have had, this is the current distribution. So it's, they're not here right now, with an exception that we'll get into. So we have had stray animals come in. So if you go to the next slide, so this is from a paper by Bob Inman, who's a wolverine biologist, and this really looks like model. This is, essentially looking at based on GPS data from animals that are collared, looking at what qualifies classifying wolverine habitat in the Western United States. So you can see where this is, and I want to point out that this kind of light gray shading there, so that if you see at the bottom there, so that's male dispersal. So essentially, females tend to set up territories right next to their mothers, but males will go on long distance migrations, or really dispersals, not migrations, but dispersals, moving into different habitat. And so they'll move through a matrix where there's not really habitat for them, like where they're just moving through, going from one place to the next. And we've seen that happen. So in the next slide, with this wolverine called M56, who was radio collared. This was in 2007, I believe it was, or 2008, where, it moved all the way from essentially in the top left there. That's right on the edge of Grand Teton National Park. It's in the Forest Service land just east of it in the Grovant. And then it moved like through the Wind Rivers there, and then went through what's really not good wolverine habitat at all. Through the Sagebrush Sea in Wyoming, until it made it down to Colorado and spent a couple of years here before didn't find any females, kept looking around, then moved into North Dakota and was actually shot by a rancher. But they can make these long distance dispersals, but really only males, and that's a key part. So males would do long distance migrations, but we're not going to get a population with only males, right? We need both males and females here, and that's part of the push for why we've been pushing to why we need a human assisted. We took the species out of Colorado through poisoning and hunting and trapping, and the way I see it is it's our responsibility to bring it back. And the animals, the species isn't going to make it back here without assistance. And so in the last slide, and I'll turn it over to Rosie. The last slide here is is this animal M56 that's collared. Megan, can you change the slide? Awesome. This M56 is male that was collared, made it into Rocky Mountain National Park. And so we've heard reports of animals of wolverines coming through Colorado, and that's very believable. And they're probably these males that we get occasional males coming in, but we don't have a breeding population, and odds are strongly against us ever getting one without human assistance. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Rosie to talk about some of the more management implications here.
All right, y'all. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the outdoor recreation aspect of wolverine reintroduction. And I'm really excited about this. Specifically, Megan, thank you so much for finding this photo, because it really shows just how much superior wolverines are to humans at climbing things. And I can say that because I'm an ice climber, so this really hit home for me. But just want a little bit about wolverines. They're really tough. For example, a radio-collared wolverine in Glacier climbed almost a vertical mile over Mount Cleveland in 90 minutes in winter. Humans tried the same thing and only made it a third of the way up. Despite the reputation for being incredibly tough, wolverines don't really pose that big of a risk to people. They're actually pretty small, about 25 to 35 pounds, and avoid humans. They just try to avoid humans at all costs. It is really rare to see them. So if you do, like Megan saw on her honeymoon, count your lucky stars, because they're going to be difficult to find. Megan, can you please to the next slide? Thank you so much. So just a little bit more insight about wolverines in Colorado. So this map of modeled wolverine habitat in Colorado is overlaid with land ownership. So wolverines tend to live above tree line and high elevation forests, right? And you can see that wolverine habitat in Colorado in the mountains and primarily on public lands. So Colorado and 94% of wolverine habitat in Colorado is on public land, and 68% of the habitat of those lands is in protected areas, specifically designated wilderness areas, roadless areas, and wilderness study areas. Megan, next slide, please. And once again, wolverines like to live, in high alpine, and they really like rugged terrain, and that is remote. They're once again known to avoid humans and developed areas, and are likely to choose to live in vast, unpopulated areas. Roughly around 7,800 square miles available in Colorado's wilderness and roadless areas. Next slide, please. So, recent research on the interactions of wolverines and winter recreation suggests that backcountry winter recreation can have negative impacts on wolverines, but also wolverines can tolerate some amount of recreation. And sorry, my little niece is crying right now, if y'all can hear that. Moving on, the study has had 3 important conclusions. First, resident wolverines establish and maintain territories and reproduce in habitat where there is winter recreation. Second, wolverine home ranges. Wolverines avoid all forms of winter recreation and increasingly avoid areas as amount of off-road winter recreation increases. What this suggests is that wolverines are not so sensitive to recreation, that a single isolated encounter with a skier or a snowmobile will have negative impacts. But it also suggests that recreation at a certain intensity will exclude a wolverine from portions of its territory. Recreation in a wolverine's territory reduces the quality of the habitat in that territory, making it a little bit harder for the wolverine to make a living and reproduce. Higher levels of recreation have a greater impact. And in Colorado, really do like our backcountry activities, winter recreation, and also new technologies are coming out every day that help recreationalists travel deeper into the backcountry. And an increasing population, we all know that Colorado is growing, is expected to increase the footprint of winter recreation across wolverine habitat. Next slide, please, Megan. So on the other hand, if y'all can see this map, little pink areas, there are 7.5 million acres of wolverine habitat in Colorado. That is quite a big area. You can see Colorado ski industry on this map is in pink. So once again, those little pink areas. Only 0.7% of modeled wolverine habitat in Colorado overlaps with ski boundaries. And I think that number is really important. It's difficult to obtain data needed to map out the extent of backcountry recreation in Colorado. I think that's something that will be done, but it is thought that there are still very large areas of wolverine habitat that don't experience intense winter recreation. Given the amount of wolverine habitat in Colorado, it is possible for us to be thoughtful and find good ways to share the snow with wolverines without impacting our opportunities for fun in the winter. Next slide, please, Megan. So, for example, one way to help wolverines cope with recreation would be to close small areas around their dens when nursing females and kits are particularly vulnerable to disturbance. Now, we are already doing this, something like this in the Front Range with climbers. Our local climbing organization called Boulder Climbing Community actually shuts down parts of the Flatirons, which is prime climbing habitat during certain parts, during certain times of breeding season for golden eagles, and they actually have volunteer opportunities for those climbers to be stewards of that land and see when chicks are fledging, and to make sure that people are respecting the closing of some of these climbing areas. So Coloradans have already proven that they do care about wildlife, and it is possible to put wildlife before our recreation needs. So there could eventually be 140 to 180 wolverines in Colorado, according to CPW estimates. And let's assume half are female. In addition, only about half of the females will produce in any given year. So this means, if math is correct, that there might be 35 to 45 dens spread across 7.5 million acres of Colorado. It would be easy to close those areas around dens to winter recreation for a short time in spring when wolverines are denning, while still having huge areas available for winter fun and exploration. I think it's something that Coloradans can do, but we do need to consider nuance and understand that wolverines can tolerate some recreation, but may not be able to tolerate recreation at all levels. We need to consider what we want for wolverines and our ecosystems in Colorado, and what values Coloradans have when it comes to living, coexisting with wildlife in the balance of recreation and habitat. Next slide, please, Megan. So, my last slide before I turn it over to Megan. Wolverines are protected as a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act. So what this means is that the Forest Service considers new projects on public lands, like opening new areas for skiing or snowmobiling or building new trails. They will have to go through a consultation process with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to determine whether the project will have significant impact on wolverines. However, the Fish and Wildlife Service will be developing a rule that streamlines that process for activities that are unlikely to have major negative effects on wolverines, which could include recreation projects in certain areas. And to tell you a little bit more about some of the legal aspects, and where we are today, how we got here, I'm going to turn it over to Megan to do a little bit more of that explaining. Thank you so much.
All right, everybody. So I'm going to talk a little bit about where we are at in the process of working to bring wolverines back to Colorado. A little history about how we got here, where we're at now, and then what the next steps are over the next couple of years to get to the point where Colorado Parks and Wildlife is able to release wolverines. And I'll also talk a little bit about how you guys can help out with that. So it's important for everybody to know that this has been a really long process. Colorado Parks and Wildlife started planning lynx and wolverine reintroduction back in 1998. You can see their old document here with that plan. But they didn't have enough resources at that time to reintroduce lynx and wolverines both. So they decided to go ahead and reintroduce lynx first. And then in 2010, they declared the lynx reintroduction a success. And they started to develop a wolverine reintroduction plan, and they did a stakeholder process. That process got put on hold in 2013 because at the time, there was a lot of uncertainty about whether or not wolverines were going to be protected under the Endangered Species Act. And the process for reintroducing wolverines is really different depending on whether they're protected under the Endangered Species Act. So just this past year in November 2023, wolverines were protected under the Endangered Species Act. And that gave everybody some clarity about that so that we could go ahead and move forward. What was kind of happening in between 2013 when the process got put on hold and this November was that a big coalition of conservation groups were working to get wolverines protected under the Endangered Species Act, led by Earth Justice, and Rocky Mountain Wild was involved in that, and a lot of other organizations. And it took, I can't even remember how many lawsuits to get that done, but wolverines are now protected under the SA. So that brings us to the Colorado State Legislature. So we have a state law here in Colorado that says that if a species is protected under the Endangered Species Act, you have to have the approval of our state legislature to reintroduce it. So we got our coalition together and worked really hard with several really great legislators in Colorado to get a bill passed to allow Colorado Parks and Wildlife to begin the process of planning to restore wolverines in Colorado. And I'm excited to report that that bill passed in May. If you guys have a chance, give a huge thank you to the bill sponsors, which are listed here on this slide, especially Senator Perry Will, who really took the lead on it. And you can see the text of the bill at the link here on the slide. So now that that bill is passed, Colorado Parks and Wildlife can move ahead with working to bring wolverines back to Colorado. It will still be a multi-year process. So the first thing that they're going to do is update their 2010 wolverine reintroduction plan to take into account the latest science and make sure that all of the technical plans around where to get wolverines from, how to release them in Colorado, those kinds of things are really well thought out, and they do a good job of doing the reintroduction in a way that'll be good for wolverines. Rosie mentioned that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is going to issue a rule. It's called a 10J rule. And what it does is basically, it takes a look at Colorado and wolverines in Colorado, and it will think through with scientists kind of what the threats are to wolverines in Colorado and whether there are some activities that can have streamlined permitting once wolverines are reintroduced. And this was something that was really important to a lot of the stakeholders, like the ski industry and the agricultural industry. They wanted to make sure that things like small things like, let's say a lift breaks at a ski area and they want to fix it. They don't want to have to go through a long permitting process for that. So anyone who has concerns around how wolverine being present on the landscape and being protected under the Endangered Species Act will affect their activities on public land can get involved in that process. There'll be lots of opportunities for public comment. So that's a place to get involved if you recreate on public lands and are kind of thinking about how wolverine reintroduction might affect your activities. Colorado Parks and Wildlife is also going to do a few additional things to address stakeholder concerns. They'll have a process where they do outreach to different stakeholders and listen to their concerns and try to make sure that plans for reintroduction take into account those concerns. They will set up a process for livestock owners to be compensated in the really unlikely instance that wolverines attack livestock. There have only been 2 cases of that ever in the lower 48, but the bill did put in place a fund to compensate livestock owners if wolverines happen to kill some sheep, which they've done, twice in the lower 48. So that's helpful. And then they're also going to develop a communications plan so they can be really transparent about the process. And I had a little bit of fun playing with AI to make this image. I think it's kind of creepy actually, but but anyway, I couldn't find a good image. So the next step after all of that, which I think will take about somewhere between 1.5 to 3 years, will be for Colorado Parks and Wildlife to actually go get wolverines and bring them back to Colorado and release them. They're still kind of working on the details around how they're going to do that, but we anticipate that the wolverines will come from Canada and maybe Alaska, and they'll be released up in the high country in Colorado in winter. Colorado Parks and Wildlife did a presentation at a Wildlife Commission meeting recently, and they identified kind of 3 areas where they're thinking about releasing wolverines. One is in the northern part of the state, kind of in the mountains around Rocky Mountain National Park. One is in the central part of the state in the Collegiate Mountains and that whole area around kind of around Buena Vista. And then the third is in the San Juans down in southern Colorado near Durango. But that's all very preliminary right now. They're still kind of thinking through that process. So it's pretty exciting. I think we could see wolverines on the ground in the next few years here in Colorado. There's still a lot of work to do. I think the conservation community is going to be working hard to make sure that wolverines can thrive once they're on the ground here in Colorado by engaging in all of those processes that I just mentioned. So you can learn more about that, donate or join Rocky Mountain Wild's mailing list to get updates on our website. We also welcome anyone's involvement in the Wolverine Coalition. If you'd like to be part of that, you can email me at Megan, MEGAN at RockyMountainWild.org. So that is that on the process, and let's go ahead and open it up for questions.
Megan, I can kick us off to break the ice. So you led the you led the coalition for wolverine reintroduction now, and also successfully and unsuccessfully from 2010 to 2013. What were the differences, and what do you think were the turning points that were able to, that were stumbling blocks that we couldn't overcome 10 years ago, but we were able to this year?
That's a great question. I think there were a few things. One thing was just having the certainty that wolverines were protected as a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act, because that kind of made it possible for some of the stakeholders to feel like they would know what the situation would be when wolverines were on the ground in Colorado. And also it gave the Fish and Wildlife Service the ability to give them some streamlined regulatory processes. So that's kind of wonky language, but basically it made it so that some of the really key stakeholders like the ski industry and the agriculture industry were more willing to support wolverine reintroduction. I also think that Senator Perry Will's involvement was really key. He worked for Colorado Parks and Wildlife back in the late 90s when they wrote the wolverine and lynx reintroduction plan. So he had a real personal interest in wolverines and in kind of seeing that plan come to fruition. And then I also feel like the fact that we reintroduced wolves here in Colorado through a ballot initiative gave legislators sort of some extra motivation to work with stakeholders and come up with legislation that was a good compromise and would still bring wolverines into Colorado. And our legislature has changed too. It's the balance of the political parties is a little different now than it was then.
You know, one thing that struck me right when we were in these discussions was that an underlying issue is how underfunded Fish and Wildlife Services, and how that plays out in real things. Like the ski industry was like, we want to upgrade a chairlift from two chairs to 4, and we have to go through a consultation process for lynx, and it can take a year to get a response, even though that's not going to affect lynx. They, which did not, long story short, were reintroduced to Colorado without a 10J. And so and that's really because of why it takes Fish and Wildlife Service so long to even just answer a question and provide a core part of what they're designed to do. Is just that they're just so grossly underfunded by hundreds of millions of dollars every year. And that becomes a real barrier to endangered species recovery. And I hadn't really thought about, we're kind of seeing how that plays out until it was kind of an eye opener to hear that. And I was like, oh yeah, that's a real problem.
Yeah, I think it's a huge problem just all the way around with the important work that the Fish and Wildlife Service does. Congress just doesn't give them enough funding to do it.
Yeah.
So we have a question in the chat from Chris. What does the Wolverine Coalition do? And I believe all 3 of you are on that coalition, so whoever wants to take it.
I can start and then maybe you guys can join in. So it's a very informal coalition made up partly of representatives from conservation organizations and then a bunch of individuals who are interested in wolverines. When we were working on getting the legislation passed, we had a legislative committee that was really focused on educating legislators about wolverines. So we were having meetings with all kinds of different legislators to tell them what wolverines were and how they were different from wolves and why people wanted to see them back in Colorado. We also know that it's really important for the long-term success of reintroduction of wolverines for the public to support it. So we have an education and outreach committee, which Rosie chairs, that is working to educate the public about wolverines. And then we have a science committee that is made up of some folks from conservation groups and some wolverine experts. And that committee really is going to be working to weigh in on Colorado Parks and Wildlife's plan to make sure that it takes into account all of the best science and it reintroduces wolverines in a way that won't harm a lot of wolverines in the process, and will make sure that they can really thrive here in Colorado. And then that working group will also be weighing in on the 10J rule, because what we want to see there is we want the ski industry to be able to do small things like fixed chair lifts, and we want the ag industry to be able to do small things on their grazing leases that don't affect wolverines. But there may be things like, poisoning and trapping of other carnivores that could actually really harm wolverines in Colorado that we won't want to see exempted from the protections of the ESA. So we'll be really paying attention to that to make sure wolverines have the protections they need to do well in Colorado, while also kind of giving stakeholders a break on things that aren't going to be important to wolverines. Do you guys have other additions to that?
You did great, Megan. I mean, I guess the only plug that I would say is that if you want to be involved in the education and outreach committee, I'll put my email in the chat, and feel free to shoot me an email and we can get you involved. More hands make light work.
Yeah, and we really welcome anyone in that coalition. We didn't select the people who are part of it. We just sent out a big request to anyone who is interested. And I think even if you're an individual who hasn't done a lot of conservation, you might have skills we could use. We can use all kinds of things you wouldn't think about: graphic design, web design, communication stuff, just lots of different things. So yeah, everybody's welcome.
And maybe I'd like to add on to one thing. I think that was an important role that the coalition, also the Colorado Wolverine Coalition, did was make sure that, so when we began, when Megan and I first talked to the governor's office just exactly a year ago, just about, I would say, so to backtrack a quick second, I think another thing that was actually a big change probably from 2013 was that we had pretty strong support from the governor's office, which really opened quite a few doors. And it turns out that the governor's pretty powerful, and so it's a good ally to have on your side. But when we began those conversations with the governor about a year ago, we recognized that he wanted it done and his administration wanted it done. And then I think another role that we played in the coalition is really giving sort of making sure that there was a voice, a public voice, sort of speaking in a coherent manner to make sure that the governor and other decision makers, senators and representatives and elected officials saw that there was like a groundswell of support, that there was like a voice for wolverines, which I think is wolverines are this like kind of legendary creature. They're this kind of amazing carnivore, and they're like a lifetime goal for people like myself to see. And then but there really are this kind of species that a lot of people care about, and there needs to be a voice for that, right? There needs to be a voice speaking for that, the otherwise very sort of dispersed community. And so I think that's another pretty important role that the coalition ended up playing.
Thank you. So Megan, you mentioned wolf reintroduction and how you had to explain to folks that it wasn't the same. And Rosie, you were integral in the wolf reintroduction. So for folks that are confused about the difference between the species or the campaigns to reintroduce them, can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I think that Stefan covered the majority of it, in the beginning. And wolves are Canidae and wolverines are Mustelidae. And so they're completely different. However, I know that with politics involved, another reintroduction of a carnivore, be it a mesocarnivore, on the heels of the reintroduction of wolves to Colorado will probably spur some concern, specifically with the livestock industry that have been facing some hardships and some growing pains with the reintroduction of wolves in Colorado. However, they are very different. And like speaking to what Megan said, there has only been 2 instances of livestock depredations in the lower 48 by wolverines. And those were sheep. Is that right, Megan? Sheep, right. And if we're thinking geographically, you know, where wolverines are going to be 13,000 feet and above, they like the high alpine, they like snow, not typically the areas in which livestock producers graze their, you know, their livestock. Not necessarily the best area to do so. So the differences in adversary is different in Colorado when it comes to wolves and wolverines. And I think that there's a lot more, I know that there's a lot more support for wolverines in their reintroduction here in Colorado. And I just hope that people give wolverines a chance and not let what has happened with the reintroduction of wolves kind of jade their opinion and thwart any ideas of wolverines coming back to Colorado. They're very different with bipartisan legislation bringing them back to Colorado. And I think that's really important to know as well. Megan, Stefan, anything you want to say?
Yeah, no, I thought that was great, Rosie. I think the only other thing I would add is that during the legislative process, there were some ag concerns raised in hearings and things about depredation. But I think overall, by the end of the process, the industry, for the most part, understood that it wasn't a major concern. So I wouldn't say they were happy with the bill, but they didn't oppose it the way that they opposed the wolf reintroduction. So I do think it's easier for them to support wolverines just because of aspects of wolverine ecology that make it so there will be pretty limited conflict.
Thank you. We had a related question that we received during registration. So what can we do as individuals to make sure the wolverine reintroduction doesn't get lumped together with the wolf reintroduction issues?
Megan and Stefan will have you step in here too. I think it's just the reiteration of just continue to reiterate that wolverines aren't wolves. And I think that it's fear-based, you know. So I think the more education and outreach that we do to just continue to hone in on the fact that they are not, they are scavengers, they are not wolves. They might share similar, you know, wolverines. My friend said that she thought that it was just baby wolves, which I think is hilarious. Just continue to reiterate that they're not wolves and they share different lifestyles, feeding patterns, and once again, if you see one, that would be amazing. Stefan, Megan, do you have anything to say about that?
I think, you know, I think a lot of the opposition was also just values based, right? I think there are a lot of agricultural, like livestock producers, who are on principle opposed to carnivore reintroduction as a just core value, right? Not because wolverines are going to affect cattle production in the slightest, but just on principle they're opposed to it. And I think that made it, you know, I think even though there was opposition, it kind of felt that it was a little bit token, right? And that, like, what was my sense in it? Yeah, snow otters is that's a great one. Yeah, so I think emphasizing that, I mean, I think a lot of, when I think of wolverines, right, like wolverines have been known to fight off grizzly bears, right, in a very specific context, and that context being that a grizzly bear is trying to steal a carcass from a wolverine. But like a grizzly bear outweighs a wolverine by tenfold. You know, the fact that a wolverine can, you know, fight off a grizzly bear is pretty amazing. You know, they raise their dens in 10 feet of snow, they climb avalanche chutes, like they're alpine badasses, right? And I think that resonates with a lot of Colorado. And I think that's a message that I think, you know, like everyone can help get across. Like, this is an animal that's representative of a lot of how Coloradans see ourselves. Like, we love the alpine. That's why Colorado is so popular. You know, and I think Wolverine is really like an emblem and a symbol of that.
Yeah, and just in a practical sense, I think folks could join our education and outreach committee, and you don't have to do a lot to be part of that, but it could give you the facts that you need to sort of educate your friends and family, or maybe to write an op-ed at some point. And we're happy to help folks with that. So I think just kind of getting the word out to folks about what wolverines are, because they think I've had similar reactions from friends and family, you know, thinking that they're baby wolves or that they're gonna, you know, eat you when you go out hiking and things like that. And I think, you know, we really need to be talking about how they're miniature mountaineers or snow otters, and help people think about the reality of wolverines and what they really are, and not think of them just as carnivores. So
Miniature mountaineers, that got me. I'm gonna put that on a t-shirt. Chris, you have to help me.
Totally, I love that. We had another question. I'm skipping a lot of these questions because I feel like they've been answered. But there's a question here. We talked about how they are on the ESA as threatened, but will wolverines ever be considered game in Colorado?
I think it's really unlikely that they'll ever be considered game. They would have to be taken off of the endangered species list. And, you know, right now there are fewer than 400 wolverines in the lower 48. And the main threat to wolverines is climate change, because they're so tied to cold and snow. And so, you know, we all know it's going to take us some time to address climate change. So I think it's fairly unlikely that wolverines are going to get removed from the endangered species list. I think the one caveat to that is that, unfortunately, Endangered Species Act listings are not always just based on the science, they're often political. And so the one scenario where I think they could be removed from the list would be, you know, if someone gets elected who is opposed to the Endangered Species Act, they might take wolverines off the list. In that case, though, I still think that Colorado Parks and Wildlife would be really unlikely to make wolverines into a game species here in Colorado.
And I think the number, for context, right? Just think about the numbers. Like, Colorado Parks and Wildlife estimates that at carrying capacity, we'll have, as Rosie mentioned, about 150 wolverines in the state. And you know, like for comparison, right? It's like the big trophy hunt that trophy hunters want is bighorn sheep, and that's incredibly difficult to get. And we have something like 6,000 bighorn sheep in the state. It was 8,000. You know, and so yeah, like it, you know, with 150 animals, is also about 50 of those are juveniles. And so you're talking about only 100 adults in the entire state, and that's once it's at carrying capacity. And, you know, that means that, you know, essentially there are only 50 females, right, in the 50 sex ratio. So, like, you know, taking out a single female is 2% of your breeding population. So it's just not a species that can tolerate a whole lot of hunting at all, or trapping.
Thank you. So we have a question from Tracy in the chat. Are there partners or experts outside Colorado that you're considering bringing into the campaign?
Tracy, if you know Hugh Jackman, you should let us know. Very powerful voice for wolverines.
Yeah, so we do have some partners and experts who are already part of the coalition that are outside of Colorado. They haven't been really active yet because we were kind of focused on legislation in Colorado, which out-of-state folks can't help with as much. but we have some wolverine experts who will be really involved in the process, like Bob Inman and Doug Chadwick, who wrote the book The Wolverine Way, I think is interested in helping out with education and outreach potentially. So, and I think we'd also like to get the Wolverine Foundation folks involved. They've kind of been on the periphery too, but yeah, we're definitely thinking about bringing in folks who can help out, who are experts from out of state.
And then in the reintroduction plan will have to be, right? We're gonna get animals from somewhere that's out of the state. And so once in that, I think planning process will also, whether it be probably Alaska, maybe Canada, where there's trapping programs, which also means that the plans, all the details have none of them have been figured out yet, but the initial thought from CPW is that there's already quite a few wolverines being trapped in Canada and Alaska, and that's for money, right? That's for profit. And so you could easily then there's an opportunity there to pay a trapper 2 to 3 times market value or whatever it would take for them to, instead of harvesting the animal for pelt, instead give Colorado a live animal, and that essentially saves a wolverine anyway whose lives would have been lost. So I think, yeah, there's going to be a partner's point being in out of state once we're actually talking about where we're going to get them from and all those like management things.
Yeah, and Colorado Parks and Wildlife has a whole team of like an international team of wolverine experts who have already helped with the plan, and I'm sure they'll continue to weigh in on it.
Thank you. So I think we have time for one more question. I'm trying to pick between the 3 that we have here. Let's go with, well, since we talked about trapping, what needs to be done to make sure wolverines do not become casualties of trapping once they're in Colorado?
It's a really good question. I think, so one thing that's nice about Colorado is that we have a ban on leg hold traps on public land. So, and poisoning for the most part on Forest Service land. So a lot of the wolverine habitat is at least free from those 2 kinds of threats from trapping. There is still, and wolverines will not be, it will be illegal under the ESA to trap wolverines on purpose in Colorado. I'm certain of that, or poison them on purpose. So the main thing that we're still worried about is sort of accidental trapping of wolverines, or accidental poisoning of wolverines when people are targeting other species. And I think there is some of that that goes on in Colorado, mostly on private land, but there are some box traps allowed on public land for trapping things like bobcats. And, there's some chance that wolverines could be harmed by those traps. So I think there's 2 things that need to happen there. One is to make sure that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service keeps strong protections for wolverines from trapping and poisoning as they go through that 10J rule process, and protects them from accidental trapping and poisoning too. And then the second thing is, if our wolverine experts really identify kinds of trapping that are happening in Colorado on public lands that we need to be concerned about, then I think we need to sort of advocate for Colorado Parks and Wildlife to address that with rules around those types of trapping. So that could be prohibiting it in wolverine habitat, or it could be something like using mechanisms to exclude wolverines from those traps. But yeah, there's definitely some work to do there.
And wolverines are like notoriously hard on traps, and so I would they can bust through a lot of stuff. And so I suspect that there's probably also, you could have like trap designs and set sort of traps that allow people who are trapping to capture a bobcat and hold a bobcat, but that would not be strong. The trap wouldn't be strong enough to hold a wolverine. So I suspect that I'm no expert on trapping, but I suspect that there are like regulatory tweaks along those nature that would be fairly easy to implement, and that would probably do a good job protecting wolverines.
I think that's true. Like in Glacier National Park, they were trapping wolverines in these giant box traps made out of like humongous logs for research. So they're live trapping them so they can radio color them. And they had to hire field techs whose job was to go out and ski out to the trap the second a trap sensor went off, and then sing outside the trap so that the wolverines wouldn't just eat through it before the researchers could get there to radio color it. So yeah, they're pretty good at escaping from from traps.
That's a dream job, just to sing to wolverines for a while. Yeah, excited for that.
Right. It could be in your future, Rosie.
So I want to thank our panel for sharing their expertise with us, and thank you all for joining us today. This is a really exciting time for wolverines, and I want to thank Megan, Rosie, and Stefan for taking the time to explain a little bit more about the species and what reintroduction will mean. We have some resources and more information on our Colorado Endangered Species Week Wolverine page, where you can take further action. So I'll drop that link in the chat real quick. And I also wanted to share a little action that we're going to have that you may be able to participate in. So we're hosting Wanderlust Wolverine Summer. We sent out 6 paper wolverines from our office in Denver. One of them is currently in my home. I don't know if you can see that. So number 1 is still in my home in Glendale, resting before the next leg of their trip. So each wolverine has a number and a QR code that will take you to more information about the campaign and help you let us know how far your wolverine got. So wherever you picked it up from. It also includes a peer-to-peer campaign to donate to help raise funds for our work with wolverine reintroduction, as well as the protection, connection, and restoration of other species in the southern Rocky Mountain region. If you want to participate and don't want to wait for the possibility of a wolverine coming to you, I did drop 2 wolverines at Hooked on Colfax coffee shop yesterday when I picked up their generous silent auction donations. So they're on the bulletin board in the back of the shop if they haven't been picked up already. So I'll also drop the link to that little thing, that little campaign in the chat. We do have 4 more days of Colorado Endangered Species Week, which includes the silent auction I alluded to before. So please join as we learn how to protect and advocate for Colorado bats and our new neighbors, the wolves, and for resources on how we can make outdoor recreation and environmental nonprofits more equitable for people from the global majority. So I'll drop the link to access the full suite of events and resources in the chat as well. And while I'm doing that, are there any last shout outs from our panel? Or anything y'all want to share coming up for you or at your organizations?
Just thank you all for coming and for your interest in wolverines.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you everybody for joining. So, and thanks for the great panel.
Well, thank everyone. And yeah, have a great rest of your Colorado Endangered Species Week.